To validate an input field on change, we're going to take a similar approach we took when submitting the form. So we should validate that input field and set the errors object accordingly. So here in our handle change method, right at the beginning, we need to do validation. But we are not going to call this .validate because this will validate the entire form. If the user is typing something here that is invalid, they should only see the validation errors related to this input field and not the entire form. So instead of calling the validate method, we should call another method that we're going to build in a second called validate property. We give it this input and it will return an error message. Now we need to update the state. So first we should clone the errors property of our state object. Const errors, we set it to a new object. Use the spread operator to clone this.state.errors. Now we have an error message. We can rename this to be more precise. Now, if this error message is truthy, we are going to store it in our errors object. So we set errors of input.name. So if the name of the input field is username, we're going to set the username property of the errors object. We set this to this error message that we get from our validation function. However, if we don't get an error message, we should delete the existing property so the error is cleared up. So we delete errors of input.name. And finally, here, when calling setState, we should also pass the updated errors object. All right, with this in place, now we need to implement this method. So let's implement it right here. Validate property. It takes an input. Now, once again, I'm going to implement a very basic validation. This is not the ideal way. Later, we're going to replace this validation with a better and more sophisticated implementation. So we need to check the name of the input field. If that equals username, here we're going to add all kinds of validations for this username field. For example, if input.value.trim equals an empty string, we should return username is required. Now, I know you're going to complain, but Mosh, we already implemented this earlier. I know, and as I told you, this is a very basic implementation. We don't want to get hung up on third-party libraries. I just want to make sure you understand the big picture before we look into the details. So here we could have other rules. It doesn't matter for now. Similarly, we're going to add a validation rule for our password field. But before duplicating this, I would like to improve this code. So you can see we have repeated this input in a couple of places. Once again, we can destructure this argument and pick name and value properties. And with this, we no longer have to repeat input. That is better. Now let's duplicate this and change it for the password field. So we change the error message as well. Beautiful. So we have two validation functions. One that validates only one property or one input, and the other that validates the entire form. Now let's test the application. So here, initially, our username is set to an empty string. That's why it's valid. If I type A, it's still valid. But if I remove this, we get this error message. Username is required. If I type something again, the error is cleared. So you have seen all these moving parts working together. Next, I will show you how to get rid of this ugly implementation.